Okay, let's very briefly introduce the idea of manipulating the DOM, D-O-M, document object model with jQuery. So one of the main uses of jQuery is to search around in the HTML page, or more specifically, the representation of the page that the browser currently has. We'll see later that we can use AJAX, and we can get information from the server, and we can insert it into the page. So what the browser represents in memory right now might not be the same as the original HTML source code. Similarly, in the interactive example we just did a few moments ago, we hid certain elements. Well, they were visible in the original HTML. They're now hidden. So the HTML elements are still there, but they have different attributes. So the point is that what the browser is currently representing in its memory, that's called the document object model, is not necessarily the same as the original raw HTML source code. So one of the main uses of jQuery is to search around in that DOM, find things, and maybe change them. And you kind of can't do anything with jQuery without at least knowing the very basics. So we'll give a super fast introduction to manipulating the DOM now. We'll apply that then to AJAX, making network requests from JavaScript, and then we'll come back later and give more details on DOM manipulation with jQuery. Okay, so here's the idea. First, find HTML elements that match a pattern. That's exactly what we did interactively. And the beauty of it is what you supply as a string to the $sign function is exactly the things we talked about in the CSS lecture. Exactly the things that you can put in your CSS file. So this was a brilliant idea of jQuery. So other JavaScript libraries said, well, we need to invent a way to search around in the page. And so they said, well, maybe we'll use XPath, or maybe we'll use the XML DOM, or maybe we'll invent our own strategy. And this was very inconvenient. But the point is that HTML developers probably already know CSS. Furthermore, CSS is a very powerful and succinct way of representing elements in the page. So jQuery said, well, HTML developers already know it. Let's not invent something new. Let's use what they know already. And so the thing that you supply in quotes there to the $sign function is a CSS selector pattern exactly like the selector patterns we talked about in the Cascading Style Sheets lecture. So that was the first brilliant idea that jQuery had. Use CSS for finding elements in the page. The next brilliant idea that jQuery had is, all right, well, once we find it, we might want to do something with it. So in the previous interactive example, we hid some elements and we showed some elements. But it's kind of inconvenient to break those all into lots of separate steps. So the first really brilliant idea that everybody liked that jQuery had was use CSS to find elements in the page. The second brilliant idea that jQuery had that everybody likes is this idea of chaining. So once you apply an operation to all the elements that matched, the return value of that first function call that manipulates those returns the original array in almost all cases. And so then you can do another operation, and it applies that operation to each of the matching elements, but then it returns the original array, and you can do a third set of operations, and so forth. And so this idea of chaining, hooking the operations together, makes jQuery calls very succinct, and that was extremely popular. So there's many, 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 many good things about jQuery. But the two brilliant ideas that really made jQuery go mainstream is the idea to use CSS to find things in the page, and that you can chain operations together once you've found an array of matching elements. Okay, so here's a quick example of chaining. So we know from our lecture on CSS that that highlighted pattern means find all H3 elements in the page that are inside divs. Not necessarily directly inside, but inside divs somewhere. And then the first thing says, add a CSS class name called yellow. Now, jQuery doesn't predefine any CSS class names. So that highlighted part will have no effect unless your CSS file has a CSS class name. Remember, they start with dots in your CSS file, called yellow. And then the result of calling add class returns the original array. In other words, that highlighted part here returns the same thing that the original lookup returned. And so then I can do another operation, like maybe hide them. All right, so CSS is the main way that you find elements in pages using jQuery, and you can chain operations together. Once you find elements that match, you can do one operation, then a second operation, and a third operation by just stringing them together with dots. All right, so let's look at a few simple examples of just finding things. And these examples should look familiar. So you can do $, and then you can put something inside the parentheses, the string inside, that starts with a £. Oh, that looks familiar. In our CSS file, if we put something with a £, it matched something that had that ID. Guess what? Exactly the same. Now, in a normal CSS file, it's not really that common to match IDs because only one thing can match. It was more common to match CSS class names. But when we get to Ajax talking to the server and getting information back, it'll be very common to use things with an ID because we want to find one particular text field. Go find this text field, read its value, and send it to the server somehow. So it will be more common when we're talking to the server to mark elements with IDs than it was when we were doing general CSS formatting. Nevertheless, the point is that the pattern inside here is exactly the same as what we saw in regular CSS. Okay, we also saw in regular CSS that if we put an HTML element name here, like P or H1 or form or H3 or div or span or whatever, it matched all elements in the page of that type. Same exact thing here. So it's exactly the same pattern, but you kind of think about it differently. With a CSS file, you say, format everything that matches in this way. With jQuery, you say, return everything that matches, and then I'll do something to it in the later steps. All right, we saw in regular CSS that if it starts with a dot, it means match things that have that CSS class. Same thing here. And just to give a kind of extensive example that we already discussed in the previous section, this says, find all spans in the page, but only if they say class equals blah, and only if they're inside, wrapped inside a B tag, and if that B tag is inside an LI element. Okay, so all of the examples on this page should look familiar. It's exactly the same way that you did it in CSS. But the operations you do on them will be totally different. The way that you find the elements, same as CSS. The operations that you can do on the elements, specific to jQuery. So let me just summarize a few of them, but we'll come back and look at all of them in more detail and introduce others as well. Val. Val says, give me the value. In particular, give me the value of a text field or something simple like a radio button or checkbox. And this is very commonly applied to something with a $. So you have a form, and one particular text field is going to be a piece of information that you're going to send to the server. You mark that with an ID. You say, find that particular text field and look up its value. And this is one of the few places where my chaining idea works differently. Val just returns the value, whereas most of the functions you apply to the array return the original array. So you could not say dot after val and put on some more elements because the return value of val is the string, the thing that was inside the text field. It's not the array of matches. All right, there's each. Each just says, take this function that you wrote yourself and call it on each of the elements that match that pattern. Add class, this is very useful. We'll do this in an upcoming example. Add the following CSS class name. In other words, act as though each of these things had said class equals that thing. Now, If you supply a CSS name that's not defined in your CSS file, it's not an error, but nothing visual will happen. So if you want to practice with this at the beginning, make sure that you've defined some CSS names that do something. They change the background color, they make it bolder, they make the font bigger, they make the font smaller, they indent it a little bit, they add a margin at the top or something like that, so that when you add those CSS names to matching elements, you can see the page change its visual appearance. We saw that you can make things disappear. Now they're not gone from the HTML page. They're still part of the DOM, they're just not visible. One of the things that we'll do a really lot is attach a function to a button. We'll say, attach this function to the button, so that later, when the user clicks on the button, something will happen. And we'll do that extensively when we get to AJAX in the next few sections. And then finally, especially with AJAX, once you talk to the server, usually by pressing a button, it fires off some JavaScript and jQuery code that goes to the server, it gets something back, and then you need to do something with the value that came back. And one of the common things that you do with the value that came back is you insert it inside some existing element. Typically you match with a pound sign there, perhaps it's a div, insert some HTML elements inside this div. Insert, a paragraph or 2 paragraphs, or maybe just a string, or maybe a string with some, red text or so forth. And so that's typically the way that you handle data that came back from the server. You parse it, you extract the meaningful information, and you insert it into the current page using the HTML function of jQuery. Okay, now I'm flying through all of these. Don't be scared. We're going to come back and revisit all of these in a lot more detail with very explicit examples. But just for your interactive practice and testing now, be aware of various ways that you can search for elements in the page. Use a CSS pattern. And then be aware of ways that you can modify or do operations on the elements that match. And here are a few of the basics.